I have a great pleasure to introduce you Mr. Peter Hessler, an American writer and journalist. He's an author of a book about Egypt, The Buried, an archaeology of Egyptian Revolution, was a finalist for National Book Critics Circle Award. He is also a winner of an American Society of Magazine Editors Award, and in 2011 was named a MacArthur Fellow. So today we'll talk about your book, The Buried, an archaeology of the Egyptian Revolution. And I would like to start from the beginning. So my question is, was it your decision to choose Egypt, or was there something different that influenced your decision?
Yeah, well, before I lived in Egypt, I was in China for more than a decade. So that's where I became a writer, and my first books were all about China. And so I lived there from 1996 to 2007. I met my wife there. My wife's name is Leslie T. Chang. She's also a writer. She's author of a book called Factory Girls about China. So we were preparing to leave China in 2007. And at the time, we felt like we wanted to, first we had to go back to the United States to finish the books that we were working on, but then we wanted to go to a country that was new to both of us. And we wanted a place that would be engaging for us as writers, that would be rich. I like the idea of going to a place with a great history like China has, but we didn't want it to be too close to China. We wanted to be out of Asia. And so we talked a lot about it. And at that time, we decided that we would go to the Middle East. And we were thinking originally of possibly Syria, but more likely Egypt. And I can remember talking with one of my editors at the New Yorker, and he said, well, Cairo is great and it's a fascinating city, but I'm afraid that it may not be, it may seem nothing changes there. It feels sort of slow, and it may be too slow after what you've experienced in China. That was like in 2008, 2009. So the idea that we had was very different from what ended up happening, because by the time we moved there in 2011, the Arab Spring had started, and the feeling in Cairo was really anything but slow or boring. And so we ended up in a very different situation than we had expected. But it was a mutual decision. It was both me and my wife, both of us are writers. We wanted to be in a fascinating place, and we also wanted to study a rich language. So Arabic appealed to us.
Oh, you mentioned that you and your wife, Leslie, both like the idea of going to a place that it will be unfamiliar for both of you, and both of you wanted to learn another rich language, which is Arabic, obviously. I know Fusha just a little bit, but I am much more familiar with Turkish language. And from my own experience, I know that in Arabic and in Turkish, native speakers are frequently referring to God for using some phrases like mashallah, inshallah, or alhamdulillah. And both in Turkish and in Arabic, there is a word that you are using in your book, which is a nizam, which means order or system. So my question is, could you say something more about your process of learning Egyptian Arabic? What surprised you the most? What was the most challenging part of this process?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of Americans, I didn't grow up speaking other languages, and I always regretted that. But I grew up in Missouri. It's in the middle of America. My family didn't travel overseas, so I didn't have the opportunity to learn another language. So, I was sent to China with the Peace Corps in 1996 when I was 27 years old. That was the first time that I really was able to learn another language, and I loved that experience of learning Chinese. So we wanted to do Arabic in the same way. So my wife and my wife grew up speaking Chinese, so she was a native Chinese speaker. So first we did an intensive course in what they call Fusha, which is like it's often, it's sort of classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic, and it's more like a literary language, and but it's not really spoken by anybody. So we did that for 2 months in the United States at a program called Middlebury. But then once we went to Egypt, we made the decision just to study what they call al-Amiya, which is Egyptian colloquial spoken Arabic. So we decided not to stay with Fusha, with the standard sort of the classical Arabic, and we wanted to just be able to communicate with people in Egypt. And that was partly because we didn't plan to travel around the region. We wanted to focus on that country. And so, we found a tutor. We were very fortunate. There was a good language school called Kalimat that we went to in Cairo, and we had this wonderful tutor named Rifaat, who was somebody that I wrote about in my book. But, Egyptians are kind of famous for being loquacious, for being very talkative, and for being characters. I mean, it's a place where people have a great sense of humor. They have a lot of charisma, and Rifaat was just one of these classic Egyptian characters. And the word that you mentioned, nizam, there was a word you heard from Rifaat all the time, because it can mean the regime. It can also mean the system. And he would always say, mafish nizam, which means there's no system. There's no system in Egypt. And he was always complaining, like many Egyptians, about the lack of system. But so the language was really critical to everything we did there. And it was, one of the best parts of the experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you and your wife had a great Arabic teacher, Rifaat, in this school you mentioned. And in your book, you wrote that he died 4 days before the 5th anniversary of the Egyptian Arab Spring. And you wrote in your book that he had qualities that seemed out of place in today's Egypt. So could you explain what do you mean by that? Why he was so special for you?
Yeah, I mean, he was what you would call a Nasserite. So, he loved Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so, his view of Egypt was that it was in decline, and that there had been a period in the 50s and the 60s under Abdel Nasser when it was going in the right direction. He believed that Egypt had this strong tradition of culture, of respecting intellectuals, and of being basically a secular society. He was a very secular person. He considered himself Islamic. He considered himself Muslim, but he wasn't very devout. He didn't go to the mosque. He wouldn't fast. So he was unusual in that regard, and he disliked the way that religion had spread in Egypt, and the way that it had become, in his view, intolerant. And he really hated the Muslim Brotherhood. And so when we were having classes with him was during the year that the Muslim Brotherhood was rising to power, and that Mohammed Morsi, who became their first democratically elected president, and Rifaat was always complaining about this. That means the brothers, and that's what everybody called the Brotherhood. And kedabin, he would say kedabin, which means they're liars, and so it was and he would get very animated, and so this to us was such an intense way to learn a language. This was not a language that we were learning in a textbook sense. It didn't feel like you're doing something abstract, because we have those conversations with Rifaat, and then I would go out and report on Tahrir Square and use all those words, nizam, ikhwan, kedabi, and all of those things would come up. So it was really an amazing experience, and he was a great teacher. Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned about the Muslim Brotherhood. So I would like to talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood organization, which was founded in 1928, but it was banned for most of its history in Egypt. And I wonder how Egypt looked like under the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the second component of my question is, what did you hear from your Egyptian friends about Muslim Brotherhood during this period of time? Because I know already about opinion from Rifaat. What about the others?
Yeah, I mean, especially during my first year and a half, we had a lot of contact with people in the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were rising, and for the first time really in their history, they were competing in an open political system. And because they were so well organized and well established, they sort of had an advantage over other political groups. There were some new parties, but they were chaotic. The brothers had been around for a long time, and even though they had often been banned, they were basically tolerated. It's kind of an unusual situation. It's not at all like say, China, where I've lived, where they will not allow any opposition party to function. In Egypt, under Mubarak, the Brotherhood, they kind of went through phases. Sometimes they'd crack down on them. Sometimes they would loosen up a bit, but the organization was never totally wiped out or totally defeated. It was always there. And in some ways, it was kind of an important, like a pressure valve almost. But anyway, so they had an identity. And so once the political system opened up, they were prepared to function as a political party. But the problem was, I think in a lot of ways, they had been traumatized by this experience of repression over so many years. So the way they functioned was they were very secretive. They didn't trust outsiders. They didn't really welcome outsiders. And they really, the thing that Rifaat always said, which was that they lied, was to some degrees it would look like that to an outsider because they made promises. Like, for example, they promised that they would not field a candidate for president because they didn't want to be seen as wanting to grab all the power in Egypt because they already had control of the parliament. And, and I talked with so many of their leaders during this period in 2012 when we were preparing for the election. And over these top guys would tell me, no, we're not going to run somebody for president. That's absolutely not going to happen. And like less than a week after the last one I talked to told me that, they said, okay, we're going to run Mohammed Morsi for president. So it kind of, it undermines your public trust, obviously. But it was a very volatile situation. And Egyptians were looking for something to believe in. They had been tired of the corruption under Mubarak. And so there was an idea in 2011 and 2012 that the Muslim Brothers would be, a more trustworthy organization in the sense of less corrupt, that they weren't just in it for money. And that because they were Muslim, and this is, by generally speaking, Egyptians are quite devout. They thought, this will be better to have religious leadership. But I think because for lots of reasons, the organization had lots of structural problems. I mean, it's incredibly conservative. The leadership is all old. This is a country where, half the population was 25 and under. The revolution was led by young people. It's a population where women, have traditionally played little role despite being a large segment of the population. Neither women nor young people played any meaningful role in the Muslim Brotherhood. And so I felt like it was an organization that in the end was very was sort of unable to lead because they were out of touch, and the people very quickly turned on them during their year in power. And the Muslim Brothers were a little delusional. I think they believed that they had a level of support that they did not have, and they didn't understand what was happening when word on the street began to turn. And you could really feel it. I've never been in a situation like that where you really could just, through the accumulated conversations with cab drivers and neighbors and people on the street, you could see this change happen over the period of 3 or 4 months from the end of 2011 to 2012. And basically the end of 2012, that people started to really hate Mohammed Morsi and hate the Muslim Brotherhood. And it became a very dangerous situation that eventually culminated in the coup in 2013.
So I wanted to talk about these young people, and I know that you and your family came to Egypt during a quiet period of time. You moved there in October of 2011, and Mubarak fell in February of that year. But we know that quite quickly the second round of protests started. So my question is, how would you describe this general attitude to protest among young people at Tahrir Square during this period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there for the initial round of the Arab Spring, back in January and February of 2011. But, from all the accounts and from everybody I knew, it was a very idealistic time. There was an enormous amount of energy. Young people felt for the first time empowered. I mean, this is, I say, a very young country, but it's a country where there's sort of a disrespect for the young people on many levels. Like within families, because it's a very patriarchal society, the young are not respected, right, for that reason. But also within the society itself, there's little opportunity for them. This is a country that's had a lot of economic problems. Young people have trouble finding jobs. At the same time, there's a lot of colleges, a lot of universities. They're often the universities are not very good, but they admit students. So students go to the universities and they don't really learn much often. They don't get prepared for jobs, and then they can't find jobs. So you have a lot of very frustrated people. There's a lot of talent in Egypt that's untapped, and they felt this intensely, and so that sort of frustration fed into the Arab Spring. And the young people were so important. They were really the heart of those protests, but they were not the heart of any of the organizations that rose to power afterward. And really, it came very quickly into a battle between two different groups. One was the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other was the Egyptian military. And both organizations have sort of an institutional disrespect for the young. Young people do not have power in either of those organizations. And so by the time we were there in October, it was getting close to the parliamentary elections, and there was sort of tension was building as they prepared for these first democratic parliamentary elections. And a round of violent protests broke out in November of that year, November of 2011. That was the first event that I covered as a journalist. And the mood it felt, it wasn't what I had seen on television from February. And everybody told me, no, this is very different. There was an anger. There was already a frustration. Some of that idealism had already started to fade. So you could already get a sense at that time that this movement might be in trouble.
You mentioned that you first lived in China, and it was as far as I remember, it was in the mid-1990s when you were a single man in your 20s, teaching in a small college. And I got the feeling that the experience which you gained as a young man in your 20s in this completely different part of world also gave you some kind of incredible insight into problems of Egypt. As a writer and journalist with different background and multiple belongings and different cognitive filters, how would you describe the most important issues that Egypt has faced over last years? You mentioned about the anger and frustration among young people, but maybe there is something more. I know it is a quite big picture question, but maybe let's try.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, the disrespect for the young is a problem. I think the disrespect for women and the lack of power that women hold in that society. And I'm talking about political power, but also power within families, within organizations, within corporate structures, within institutions. I think that's a major problem, and that was a contrast with China. The China that I went to in 1996 was in many ways quite sexist, but much less than Egypt, and it was improving, and you could see women gaining status. And during the 10 years that I lived in China, you really could see that, and especially economic status. I mean, the young women in China were the ones who really drove a lot of that industrial development in terms of these factory towns in the east and the south. They were built on having young women come from the villages, go there, and become workers. And they weren't just automatons. I mean, they would earn money, they would gain skills, and often they went and did their own business, or they found their own path to a better life. And so, in many cases, women were empowered by economic opportunity. And I always felt like that was really something that Egypt needed. It has a very low rate of women working outside the home. And when you don't have economic power, that puts you at a disadvantage in your family. So, I think that's a big problem. I think another major issue in Egypt in terms of the structural issue is, you're talking about a place that for decades and decades has depended a lot on foreign aid. There's aid that comes from the Americans, especially military aid. There's aid that comes from Europe. There's aid that comes from the Gulf countries. And I think in some ways it prevents Egyptians from finding Egyptian solutions to these Egyptian problems. And it sort of saps people's motivation. And I think, Egypt, you look, for example, it has very weak industrial sectors, very weak manufacturing. And this is the most populous country in the region. It's got a lot of young people. They should have factories. They should have development zones like they had in China, like they had in South Korea in the 1980s and 90s. So I think there's a lot of wasted talent there, and a lack of direction.
Nizam.
Yeah,
While reading your book, because now we are talking about the challenges, you mentioned about these challenges, and while reading your book, to be honest, I was quite astonished by the fact that in Cairo, there is this lack of institutional structure, this Nizam you're writing about. And in the same time, we have this high level of self-organization among Egyptian society. And in your book, it is quite visible on the example of ashwa'iyat or Zabalin community. So could you share your thoughts about this experience, which can be at first quite astonishing from the European perspective?
Yeah, and also from the, my perspective was American, but also Chinese. And in China, you go to Beijing, and it feels like the political center of a country that has an authoritarian government, right? I mean, you know who's in charge when you're in Beijing. But in Cairo, the word that you mentioned, ashwa'iyat, which means like kind of the informal parts of the city that are not very regulated, that were built illegally, that's like more than 65% of the population of Cairo. So, 65% of the population in the capital live in illegally built neighborhoods. It's sort of shocking, right? I mean, you have this idea that this is an authoritarian country. But that was one of the things I learned quickly after showing up in Egypt, is that there's different types of authoritarian countries. There's different types of authority. And Egypt is an example of an authoritarian country where there often isn't a lot of authority down on the ground. And in those ashwa'iyat, I mean, because I became friends with the man who picked up garbage in my neighborhood, and I would go to his neighborhood where he lived in the informal part of Cairo. And it was just unbelievable, the level of self-organization in these places. I mean, you would never see a police officer there ever. And yet I could go there at any time of the day or at night and feel completely safe, much safer than I would be in an American city. And that's because people looked out. People in the community kind of made sure everything was okay. There were mosques in the community and religious organizations that also served an important function. So it was quite impressive in many ways. And like the homes, you wouldn't say they're well built. They're not built to any code or standards, but they function. These were not like, it wasn't a shanty town. I mean, these were brick and concrete houses, and they had plumbing, they had electricity, but none of this was done legally. They would just build the place, and then they'd tap into the government electricity supply, and somebody from the government would eventually go over and put a meter on it. And they did this all the time. For example, that neighborhood that I went to, it was right next to the Ring Road, which is kind of like a main highway that circles Cairo. And of course, the people wanted to have access to this road, but they didn't. When the people built the road, they didn't build ramps for these neighborhoods, for these sort of ashwa'iyat. And so after the revolution, the people in this neighborhood, through a mosque, organized on their own and gathered money for a construction crew, and they built 2 highway ramps so that they could get on and off this highway. And it's amazing. This is in the capital, and you have a major infrastructure building project that's completely illegal, and nobody from the government has anything to do with it. And it's just locals organized through a mosque, and they hire engineers and construction workers, and they get the equipment, and they build these 2 ramps. And they didn't look great, but they worked, And then after it was on, what does the government do? they go and they put a sign on it. They give it a name, So this was sort of how things worked in Cairo. And to me, that was very eye-opening because that, it's completely different from what I'd experienced in China. This level of self-organization, it was incredibly impressive. And at some level, it was inspiring. But you also realize that there were limits to it. You can't self-organize all the way to the top. You hit limits with what you can do. You can build these ramps on the highway, but it doesn't work to build like a functioning economic system from top to bottom. You do need some leadership. You need some real structure.
You mentioned about one of the characters from your book, Sayyid, garbageman from ashwa'iyat. But I would like to mention about the other character from your book, which is Manu. Manu's story, you are describing Manu's story. Probably it is his nickname because his real name is, as far as I remember, it was Muhammad. Is that right?
Yeah. No, like many Egyptians, his name was Muhammad. And Egyptians are big on nicknames. It's a great country for nicknames, and so many people, like my daughters, who were babies when we moved there, we still use their Egyptian nicknames that they were given by their nanny. My daughter Natasha became Nush Nush, and my daughter Ariel became Aro, and we still use those nicknames. So Egyptians are great on nicknames, and of course, if you call Muhammad, half the men are going to turn their heads, right? Everybody's named Muhammad, so they often have nicknames, and his was Manu.
Oh, that's right. All right. So, reading his story, I got the feeling that you were able to give a reader insight into oppression and the mechanisms that determine gay life in Cairo, in Egypt. And we know from your book that in the end, Manu decided to move to Germany. And I came to conclusion that it is very uneasy or even unsafe to be an LGBT person in Egypt, and because Manu experienced a personal struggle and anxiety. And his story that you described in your book also gave me a reason to think about the diversity and political climate in Egypt. And how would you describe this political climate when General Sisi entered the picture? Because at first, he probably got a huge support from society. Is that right?
Yeah, no, when he came to power, I mean, the coup was in 2013. And by the time the coup happened in the summer of 2013, Egyptians were really tired of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was so much chaos during that period. And to be honest, some of it was because of resistance. And for example, the electricity would get cut off, the water would get cut off. And it was clear that there were opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood who were making sure that things didn't work well because they were still in the government. But at any rate, Egyptians were tired of this, and there was a great relief when the military stepped in, and Sisi had enormous amounts of support. And the Egyptians were used to having a strong man. I mean, I mentioned Sayyid, my garbage man, and he, when Sisi came to power, one of the things that Sayyid would tell me is like, we need a leader who's not nice. We need a leader who's strong. He has to tell people what to do. We're pharaonic people. And Egyptians will often tell you this, we're pharaonic people. We need a pharaoh, we need a leader like that. And so there was this sort of appetite for somebody who comes and just lays down the law. And so people were willing to do it. And then, quite quickly, it became very repressive, much more repressive than it had been under the Muslim Brotherhood, and even more repressive than it had been under Mubarak. But there was a level of exhaustion among Egyptians. They were tired. They didn't want another revolution. They wanted things to be quiet again. And so I think that really the feeling that people had was, maybe this isn't ideal, but it's stable, and that's enough.
You mentioned in our conversation about Morsi and Sisi, and in your book you are describing several influential figures in history of Egypt, like Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, Morsi, and Sisi, and taking into consideration history of political movement in Egypt, I wonder which politician is still present and especially significant in the hearts and minds of Egyptian society? Who is the biggest one?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting when you look at these leaders, they are very powerful figures, and not every culture and not even authoritarian countries don't have these sort of powerful figures in a lot of ways. In the imagination, I think definitely the two most important are Nasser and Sadat. Those are, and especially Nasser, even though it's been a long time since he was, the ruler of Egypt, his shadow continues, I think, to loom large in Egyptian life, and he set up a lot of the structures that exist to this day. And also, he kind of established this somewhat schizophrenic relationship with Islamism, which is, on one hand, you sort of allow the Muslim Brotherhood, allow the Islamists some space, and then you crack down on them. And there's this back and forth that is there was a long history of that in Egypt. And of course, Mubarak did that for 30 years, where, sometimes he would allow the Muslim Brotherhood some breathing space, and sometimes he would crack down on them. There's a long pattern of that. So Nasser is a very powerful figure, and of course Sadat is, and he's an unusual figure because, for a number of reasons. One is that, his opening Egypt to Israel and recognizing Israel, is an amazingly brave thing, actually, when you look at that. It's remarkable that this individual was able to do it. He was kind of a brilliant, instinctive politician in a way, and for him to be able to do that was visionary, and he paid for it, right? I mean, this is what resulted in his execution, in his assassination. And so, he's a very tragic figure. I think as an outsider, maybe particularly as an American, he was the leader that I could connect with the most. And I found him to be a fascinating figure because, and first of all, he was from a very poor family, and his part of his background was Sudanese. His ancestors had been slaves at different points. He was from a very poor background. And so he had this sort of power and ability, and he rose in this country. And then once he got to power, he did this remarkable thing in terms of opening relations with Israel, and sort of turning Egypt away from the Soviet Union toward the United States.
We are talking about the politics, but I would like to switch to your Chinese experience, because in Egypt you could observe Chinese married couples selling women's underwear, and these are one of the examples of Chinese business activity in Egypt. And I wonder, how would you describe this relation between the Chinese and their Egyptian customers? Because I'm especially interested in this issue because in your book you wrote that the Chinese dealers survived in Egypt with little knowledge and curiosity about the cultural environment and lack of cultural awareness, which actually functioned very well as an effective business strategy. So how would you describe this relation between Chinese and the Egyptian customers? What was so special?
Yeah, this was an interesting project because it wasn't something that I had heard about. I mean, I just stumbled onto it. I was doing research in what they call Upper Egypt, so the south of Egypt, which is very poor, and I was in a very remote place. And somebody mentioned to me that there's a Chinese guy in this market, and I wasn't sure if this was really true. So I went in the market, and sure enough, there was this Chinese guy there, and he was selling women's lingerie, which is just bizarre. And I was like, how did you get here? I started talking to him in Chinese. How did you get here? And he's all, oh, my cousin sells the same thing in Sohag, and my this other guy from my hometown sells it down in Luxor. And then I started to realize that there was this network of Chinese entrepreneurs all up and down the Nile in these really sort of very remote and undeveloped cities, and all of them were selling lingerie. With usually it was a couple, Chinese husband and wife, and so I spent a long time. I would go and find these people and just to see how it worked. And their relationship as you say, they almost never spoke much Arabic. They just learned the real basics entirely by ear. They never took classes. They didn't even have phrase books. It was really crazy. But they survived and they actually thrived, and it was partly because they were selling this sensitive product. So they're selling women's underwear. And traditionally in southern Egypt, a woman can't really run a business. You don't have female entrepreneurs in these conservative cities. It's very unusual. So who sells underwear? It'd usually be a man. It makes the female customers uncomfortable. And they felt more comfortable with this Chinese couple. There's a woman there, and the man is not threatening. He's not part of their culture. And so they felt more comfortable. So this worked really well. And actually the Chinese and the Egyptians in those places, they tended to get along very well. This was not in other parts of Africa. There's a lot of resistance to Chinese and there's resentment. That wasn't the case in Egypt. They played a different role. I think if we're looking at their role, it's useful to think there's one of the early German sociologists, Simmel. He wrote an essay called The Stranger, and he talked about the role that a certain type of person plays in a community. He called this person the stranger. And this is somebody who is in the community, but not of the community. He's an outsider, and he plays a role there, but he's not part of it. And that person plays this could be the postman who comes through every day, or it could be a teacher who lives in a different place and comes in and teaches. It could be anybody who's an outsider. That's me also in Egypt or in China. But the Chinese in Upper Egypt, they were playing that role. They were the stranger. And in some ways, people could feel more comfortable with them. They were outsiders. They were non-threatening. And as a result, they observed things. It was useful for me to talk to them because they had real insight often.
We talked about your Chinese experience in Egypt, and I would like to ask about your opinion. What is stronger now among Egyptian society after the revolution? Is it a desire of change, or maybe it is a desire of stability?
I mean, I haven't been to Egypt since the pandemic started, of course, so it's been a while since I've been there. But I mean, I think the very strong feeling that I've had on my most recent trips is that people want stability. There is not that deep desire for change. I think there is a fear of change. It's a very conservative culture. Religion plays a role, but that's not the only thing at work. I really believe these family structures, these patriarchal structures, are a big part of it. And I think there is, it was very different again when I lived in China in the 1990s. It's interesting because China, of course, politically, there's no change, right? And the Communist Party has been in power since 1949. But there has been a lot of social change at different times. And in the 1990s, you could feel that. You could feel people leaving the countryside, going to the cities, redefining their communities, redefining their roles in their families. And Egypt hasn't had that happen. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think basically the lesson that the average Egyptian took from the revolution was that it was a mistake, and that it's better to accept things the way that they are.
Quite pessimistic, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's pessimistic in a way. I mean, and it's hard to communicate this in Egypt because, in terms of the structures and the political system, I do tend to be pretty pessimistic. But on the ground, dealing with individuals, I don't feel that way. Egyptians are amazing. I mean, and it's sort of, that's what makes the place so great to live in, is because they're colorful, they're engaging, and there is this incredible energy and talent, like the garbage man that I wrote about, Sayyid. I mean, this is somebody who didn't go to one day of school, but he was hardworking and he was resourceful. He was actually highly intelligent. I never actually had a good friend who was illiterate, right? I mean, by the time I went to China in the 1990s, the only people who couldn't read were quite old. And now there's almost no illiterate people in China. And in the US, Sayyid was, he couldn't read at all, but he was highly intelligent, and so dealing with somebody like that is, in a way, it's you feel bad for him, but you're also impressed that he's able to build this life, because he had a good family, he had a good home, and he made a good income, So I'm sort of pessimistic on the structural level in Egypt. But I'm optimistic about the people themselves. And the other thing about Egypt is it's not going to collapse. Egypt is always going to be there, right? It's different from Syria, different from Iraq. And that's because the borders of that country were not just drawn by some British person in a library or something, right? I mean, this is the oldest country on earth in some sense, right? And so, and the Egyptians believe they are Egyptian. They have this very powerful sense of identity. And that's something that helps hold the country together even in these hard times.
You mentioned about the powerful sense of identity among the Egyptian society, and now I would like to focus on the second part of your book, which is incredibly important from my perspective, because for some people it might be, quite irrelevant, but for the others it might be very inspiring experience. And a few days ago, Egyptians witnessed a brilliant procession of 22 royal mummies, which were transported from the Egyptian Museum to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. And you also spent many days on archaeology digs, talking to scholars who work there. And I wonder what you learn about Egypt while visiting all these places.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the reasons I wanted to go to Egypt, because I'm interested in archaeology and I love the ancient past, and it's such a rich part of the country. And I always feel like we have a tendency to look at the archaeology and then look at the modern stuff, and they never mix. But in fact, I think there's a lot of interaction between them, and I liked the challenge of seeing them both at the same time. You learn a great deal from the archaeology. I mean, one thing that you learn is the incredible power of that landscape. I mean, it's an amazing thing, that civilization developed in this place that gets no rain. It's this incredible desert. With one river going through, and somehow that valley is so fertile, and it was also so stable, and the flood cycles were so stable that it created the environment for this incredible civilization. But that sense of isolation is really powerful. Like I describe in the book, when you go to Abydos is where the earliest hieroglyphs were found there, and sort of the first kings of Egypt came from this place in the south. If you stand on the banks of the Nile there, and if you go west, you hit the desert immediately, like within 5 miles. And from there, if you go west, you don't cross another river until you're in Florida, until you're in the United States. There's just this incredible expanse of desert across Africa, and you've got this one speck of green, and somehow that built civilization. And that's a really powerful thing. And seeing that landscape, and thinking about how it had shaped this culture, gave me a different perspective on Egypt.
And we are talking about the archaeology and your experience. And in your book, you are describing the sense of cycles, this ancient sense of cycles. So what was so important for you that you decided to describe this in your book?
One thing that fascinated me when I looked at ancient Egypt was talking to scholars was that ancient Egyptian, like their view of time was not the way we would look at time. For us, it's like a clock in the corner of your computer ticking away, right? And it goes in one direction. And ancient Egyptians had two different words for time, and one was jet and one was nehe. And jet is time without motion. It's eternal. It's unchanging. And nehe is a time of cycles. That time goes around and that the same things happen again and again. And nehe, that cycles, obviously comes from the Nile, from living in this place where every year the river floods, and then the floods recede and you plant your crops, and then the next year it happens again. It gave them this powerful idea that things happen again and again. And on the other hand, living next to the desert where nothing changes, where time feels like it's frozen, like it's eternal. So they had these two things in their eyes that, these were not, they weren't clashing, they both existed. And that was a powerful thing to think about because, especially in Egypt, this idea of cycles, because when you read ancient Egyptian history, you recognize all kinds of things, like, for example, the way that the pharaohs, often they would try to use nostalgia for political purposes. So they would declare what they would call a wehem mesut. Wehem mesut means a renaissance, basically. So, a pharaoh would come to power and he'd say, this is a wehem mesut. We're looking back to the glory years of 200 years ago or whatever, of the previous pharaohs, always looking back. When the Muslim Brotherhood came to power after Mohammed Morsi was elected, what was their program called? The Nahda, which is the Arabic word for Renaissance. It's the exact same idea. And then we're going to go back to the great Islamic tradition of the past. It's a very deep political instinct. And, when you read about the ancient Egyptians, they were brilliant politicians. Obviously, it's not a democracy, but in order to have a civilization that lasts for that long and to do things like building the pyramids and these amazing temples, you have to have political genius. And many of the political strategies that they used, you can see people today still using them. Make America great again, right? I mean, Donald Trump, that's Nahda, it's wehem mesut. It's the same thing that the pharaohs were doing, 5,000 or 4,000 years ago, looking to the past, trying to say that we're moving back to an ideal moment. And there's many examples like that. So this idea of cycles, I think, is useful. Or, it's sometimes we have this sense of progress and time always moves forward. And I don't think that's strictly true. There's very deep human instincts that have always been there. And despite our sophistication and our modernity, we are in many ways very recognizable as the same people who lived in ancient Egypt.
So I think that you would agree with me that this ancient sense of cycles that you are describing in your book, which is called Jet and Naha, it's quite similar to the political cycles that you could observe in Egypt, because you already mentioned about the Nakhta. And this is some kind of process that can be seen in other countries. You mentioned about the US and Make America Great Again. So it is related and mixed, I think.
Yeah. And I think also there is an incredible human tendency toward authoritarianism. I mean, I think really, and when you read when you talk to archaeologists, they often talk about this, that you feel that there is a pull there, right? I mean, there's something that it's, we have this idea sometimes as residents of Western Europe or as residents of the United States or whatever, people who live in democracies have this feeling that this is a system that's permanent, that is just the way it is, but it's not, right? I mean, this is a pretty recent thing. And for all of human history, there has been this tradition of investing authority in one person or in a small group of people and letting that person, invariably a man, make decisions for everybody and often behave brutally. And so you feel there is this tension and that humans have an instinct toward this. And it's an interesting period because, of course, I think in the last 5 years, we've seen this in a lot of cultures. We see it in the United States, here in China, where I am right now. It's a very powerful authoritarian moment.
Oh, we can also see this moment also in this part of Europe where I live. I have also question. Maybe I should start with this question, but I will try now. So I wonder, how did you come up with the title of your book? Because I wonder, what was your idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically because when I was researching in that place called Abydos, which is it's the earliest, the site where the first kings came from in ancient Egypt, and it's the site where the first hieroglyphs were founded. They date to about 3100 BC or so. I was very interested in the locals who would work on the digs, but who often didn't have a very sophisticated understanding of the past, but they were very close to it. They lived there and they helped the archaeologists on their projects. And when they would refer to the places where the digs were, they called it el-Madfuna. El-Madfuna, that means the buried. And that just meant this was the part of the desert where traditionally cemeteries had been located, and also where many of the old monument sites and things were buried underneath the sand. And so people used that term, el-Madfuna. And I found it just very evocative. I think it's a really interesting image, and this idea of the past being buried and of you trying to uncover it. As a writer, that's very appealing. And so, I like that idea. And I also liked it because it kind of connects to me with the political moment, which in some ways there was this hopeful moment of the Arab Spring in Egypt. And then in a sense, it was buried under the weight of authoritarian structures, under the weight of tradition, under the weight of economic weakness and many other factors.
Al-Madfuna, you mentioned Al-Madfuna. It is I guess it is a shorter version of Al-Araba, Al-Madfuna. It is still used, isn't it, in Egypt?
Oh yeah, no. This is what the villagers would call that. Would call those areas and almost every village that was near an archaeological site, that was the term they would use, el-Madfuna. They call it el-Madfuna.
All right. I would like to sum up our today's conversation, and I would like to share my own opinion on your book. Actually, I admire it because of its large context. You're writing about the politics, you're writing about the culture, you're writing about the language, but also what especially drew my attention is that you are looking on average Egyptians without this superiority. And I think it was very precious from my perspective. Frequently, you are describing stories of Sayyid, Manu, and your Arabic teacher Rifaat, and other characters as well. But I think that these stories reveal the social forces that helped establish the trajectory of the Egyptian revolution. And also, your book gave me the space to think about others, diversity, other political climates. And I would like to thank you for this conversation. And maybe, as I mentioned at the beginning, maybe it will be opportunity to have a face-to-face conversation here in Poland, in real space. When pandemic is over, it would be a wonderful.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate very much your interest and also your careful reading. I mean, it's a long book, right? And so, it may be too long for some people, but
Not for me.
I like the idea of. I mean, Egypt is a challenging, complicated place, and I wanted to try to capture that, and try to capture some of the richness.
Yes, definitely. And I am fascinated when it comes to the language because, as I mentioned, I am not very familiar with classic Arabic, but I know Turkish. And in Turkish, we have a lot of Arabic words.
Well, there's huge numbers of Turkish words in Egyptian Arabic. There's a lot because obviously, it was run by the Ottoman Empire, right? I mean, there's a lot of Turkish. I mean, it's one thing that's great about studying Egyptian Arabic is you have these loan words from all over the place. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
Definitely. That's right. It's so inspiring experience. All right. So I think that it will be everything from me. So I will let. Thank you very much for this amazing conversation.